So our next lecture is about the Lower Niger. So the Kingdom of Benin. The picture you're looking at right now is from the British punitive expedition from 1897. That's somewhat of a euphemism, I think you'll see after I describe what happened. So how this went down, there's a couple of different stories. I'll give you the other story in the next one. Is a British officer went to visit the Kingdom of Benin, and he goes to the main city. And when he gets there, he gets to the city gates. I'll show you some pictures of some of the gates and walls around it. And he asks if he could see the Oba, who is the king of the Edo people. And the people at the gate tell him that, sorry, this isn't a good time. We're having a festival, and it's for Edo people only, so we can't let any foreigners in right now. Come back in a couple of weeks, and we'll try to set you up with something. And the British officer took that as an offense to that, and he tried to go in anyway. He came back later and tried to go in anyway. So some of the Edo people captured him and his men and killed them. So the British took an opportunity with this to retaliate. But they weren't only retaliating against the death of this particular officer. They had also already taken over most of what is modern-day Nigeria at this point. And the Kingdom of Benin was one of the holdouts. And as the 20th century dawned, and we'll kind of talk about this when we get to Central Africa a little bit later on, European imperialists couldn't be as nakedly brutal as they had been previously because they would get pressure from home. So they had to come up with an excuse to be able to take over this area, which again is a modern-day Nigeria. And with the death of this officer, they had their excuse. So they sent a garrison in. They deposed the Oba. They stole all the art, and that's what this picture is. They had actually taken art from shrines and from the walls of the palaces and took it home with them. And then once everything settled down in 1914, the Oba was restored. The palace was rebuilt. But the art, including shrines and all of the art on the walls of the palace, were never returned. So the other story that tells some other ideas about exactly how it went down. On January 12th, the British delegation was ambushed by an Edo force that by all accounts acted without the Oba's knowledge. Almost the entire party was killed, including Phillips, that's the officer. In quick order, a large British military force, deemed the punitive expedition, was assembled, and on February 18th, they arrived at Benin City under the orders to invade and conquer it. In time, they captured the Oba Ramwen and sent him into exile to Calabar, a town east of Benin. So the picture you're seeing here, all of these walls at one time had these bronze plaques, which I'll show you in detail a little bit later on, attached to it. And what these bronze plaques were is they were basically a history of the Edo people, the Oba royalty, and other people. And these stories were taken down and distributed all throughout the world. So what I found kind of interesting about the movie Black Panther, I hope you all have seen it. In the beginning of the movie, they reference this particular event. The character of Eric Killmonger goes to a museum, and he talks about how these pieces were stolen from Benin. And he was not exaggerating. Every piece that you see in every museum in the world from the Kingdom of Benin, including the Detroit Institute of Art, was stolen from this particular event. Every single one of them. There were no pieces that you will see in a museum that was acquired in any sort of legitimate way. So one question you may want to think about if you're looking for something to post on the extra credit board, is what should be done. Should museums around the world return these pieces? Should they talk to the Edo people and ask them what they want to do? What do you think should be done with these types of pieces? And how should we treat the pieces that you see in museums? Because I notice most of the time when I go to museums, I don't see a mention of the British punitive expedition on the notes and the signage next to the pieces. A lot of museums are doing a better job of making that happen, but some aren't. But even given just putting a note, is that enough? So think about that, and that could be something we could discuss in the extra credit board. So some of the pieces have been returned, but that's only because individual British soldiers brought some of them home and then didn't sell them, just put them in their basement or whatnot. And their descendants have taken upon themselves to find out what these pieces are and get them returned to the Edo people. So the city that was destroyed was one of the most remarkable cities in the world at this particular time. You can see this picture from this illustration from the 17th century. We have these walls and this just tremendously expansive city. These walls were made out of structures, but also made out of dirt. And these walls were one of the most expansive human structures created up until this point. Obviously, since then, with the highway system in the United States, there's bigger structures. But at the time, this was one of the biggest and most expansive structures that humans had ever created. And when Europeans first visited the city, they were extremely impressed. They had never seen anything quite like it. So this example from a Portuguese friar, he says, Great Benin, where the king resides, is larger than Lisbon. Lisbon is a city in Portugal. All the city streets run straight, and as far as the eye can see, the houses are large, especially that of the king, which is richly decorated and has fine columns. The city is wealthy and industrious. It is so well governed that theft is unknown, and that people live in such security that they have no doors in their houses. So this is something to think about. Perhaps the writer is exaggerating with the no crime, but perhaps not. Whenever you have a society where people feel supported, and you won't generally have people stealing from each other, and also crime won't be defined in a way that criminalizes people for normal behavior. And one of the reasons why this city may have been remarkable to the Portuguese is that European cities through the Middle Ages had grown in a very kind of like haphazard type of way. They were cramped, they were dirty, they didn't have good infrastructure to keep a healthy environment for people, and they were rife with disease, crime, and all that sort of thing. So to see a city like this that was clean and well organized would have been really remarkable for a European at this time. That the city was organized on this kind of grid on circles type of pattern shows that the Edo people had lived in dispersed areas before, or perhaps in another urban agglomeration, and this one was created from the ground up. So think of, in the modern world, like Washington, D.C., a city that was created out of a swamp and drawn in, and then people lived in it. That's what Benin City most likely was. Hundreds of years ago, they created it. So this is the king of Benin. It's showing the modern king, and he has died recently. I should put in the the dates of his death. The oba, the regalia that he wears currently, is actually not the original regalia. It is a very heavy type of regalia, and it's made out of a rare type of seashell that is this kind of beautiful orange color. The type of regalia the modern oba wears is based on traditional depictions of the oba, especially the last ones in the 19th century that I'm going to show you. So Aridia Ua is the 38th Oba in the dynasty. So what you see in the city of Benin, going back all the way to the 15th and 16th centuries, are these bronze portraits. Some of them are of women, and they call those queen mothers. And then the ones of men, of kings, are called obas. So the earliest heads we see, kind of like when we were looking at Ile-Ife, were very naturalistic. So this piece right here, like Ile-Ife, idealized, perfectly symmetrical, incredible proportions, beautiful type of figure. And they were thinly cast. So the idea with these earlier ones was to create a naturalistic type of portrait. All of this art I'm going to show you had survived in the palace until the British punitive expedition. So as time goes on and later centuries, we see increasing stylization and we see thicker casts. So this one we're seeing of the Oba. It's hard to tell that it's thicker cast, but you can see that it's more stylized. The shapes of the face are less naturalistic, and we're getting something that is more abstracted. So what happened during this time is originally with European contact, the Edo people were able to get a little bit of wealth very, very early on by trading with the Europeans. But as time went along, with the slave trade and with various other resources being taken out of Africa, all of the kingdoms and empires that had gained a little bit of wealth early on lost it continually until the 19th century. So what you see is kind of like the opposite going on as far as what they're showing symbolically. So even though during this entire time period I'm going to show you, the kingdom of Benin is declining in wealth and power, they're showing more heft in the bronze to show more wealth. So this is kind of like a fake it till you make it type of idea. So the middle period is when we start to see stylization like this. And then as we go on, the regalia of the Oba becomes more and more complex. We get more and more stylization. You can see how his face is very, very cylindrical. And with the regalia growing as time goes along, see more regalia added to the back, and you can really see how stylized it is when you see it in profile. And the latest ones are even more stylized. They have very thick bronze. You can see how the bronze at the bottom is kind of like gooping up, just very, very thick bronze, and more regalia added. So like the thickness of the bronze showing wealth, we see the regalia getting more complex. Remember, the shell is hard to acquire that this regalia is made out of, so it shows more wealth, even though wealth and power are declining throughout this period. They call some of these figures like wings and flange. It could represent symbolically eagle feathers, but we're not sure exactly. And modern Oba are not. The modern Oba are unsure as well. So these latest ones in the 19th century, the ones that the modern Oba bases his regalia on. So as far as how bronze casting came to the Edo people, we're not sure exactly historically. A lot of places around the world developed bronze casting independently, and then other ones developed bronze casting through influence of others. We don't know exactly what happened, but we do know a legendary story that kind of tells you a little bit how bronze casting functions and the importance of it amongst the Edo people. So these pieces are cast using the lost wax process. And I will include a video that will show how this process is done, basically, if you haven't seen it before. I've made pieces like this before. I took a bronze casting class, and it's quite incredible type of process. If you're looking for something to post on an extra credit board, if you've ever done bronze casting or any sort of metal casting before, post a story about it and let us know what you think. And perhaps those of you that have actually done some metal casting will have an idea on why this is seen to be such an amazing thing. So only the Oba could commission bronze and ivory. And we'll talk about how the ivory is acquired in a minute. And sometimes they're gifted to others for diplomacy or to show loyalty to the king as the kingdom of Benin had expanded. So the technique itself has a legendary origin. Ogula, who's the fourth Oba, that's a historical figure, asked the king of Ile Ife to send a master metal caster. And his name was Aguega, and he was worshipped by the Bronze Casters Guild, Ogunaromwan, and they believe that he brought, kind of an organized society to, along with this bronze casting, to the Edo people. So again, we have another connection. Not only did Yoruba trace their origins to Ile Ife, and remember that means navel of the world, but also the Edo people in the kingdom of Benin. So this is a modern bronze caster who's making things not necessarily for the royal court, but a lot of people buy these. They sell them, for tourists or for local people to have something kind of cool. So it's no longer just the Oba that can do this, but traditionally only the Oba could do it. So a couple of amazing things. We've already seen the bronze heads. These are carved elephant tusks, so that's what ivory is. And if you were under the authority of the Oba, the king would receive a tribute of one tusk for each elephant that was killed in the area. And they would take these tusks and they would carve them with stories of past Obas or of the present Oba, the person that commissioned it. So like in your Western art classes, you'll learn about the column of Trajan. That's a basic idea with this. It shows the story of past victories, but also provides kind of a philosophical justification for the rule of the Oba. When you get in close, you can see how delicately these are carved, done in a very similar style, the same style that we're going to see with the bronze plaques. So it tells exploits of the Oba and past Oba, and of course, present Obas wouldn't want to relate their success and victories to the past Oba. So how these pieces were originally used were in shrines. The shrine we're seeing here is one of the shrines of the just past Oba, but it used to be that all of the Obas and Queen Mothers going back to the 15th century had shrines, all of which were taken apart, disassembled, and sold all around the world during the British expedition, punitive expedition. So how this would work is when a previous Oba died, his son would commission bronze heads, plaques, and ivories. You can see how when we were looking at the heads before, they had holes in them. So these ivory tusks would go into it and in their final place in these shrines. So in this picture, you can see an Iban sword right here being held by this Oba figure. And that is a ceremonial type of sword. And the Oba would commission it, and you can actually use it as a sword. You can kind of see with the way it's shaped. The Oba would commission it and use it to show as a gift, to show that this person you have fealty to me. For diplomacy, if they were trying to make a deal with a neighboring culture, they would give these out. They even gave them out to Europeans originally. So these types of swords, they represent the power of the Oba, and he can distribute it as he likes. So how this would work is the Oba son would pour the crucible for the centerpiece. Those of you who've done bronze casting already know what that is. If you haven't, the crucible is basically a heat-resistant container, and whenever you get the molten metal to pour it into your mold, out of the furnace, you would use this crucible. And to me, that was the most amazing part when we saw it. Forging from fire, it's a very kind of epic type of experience. So in it, we see the Oba and then courtiers and chiefs. So just like we saw with the past Oba in the photograph a little while back. He's holding an Iban sword. So there was once a shrine for each Oba. Now the last four, since the Oba was restored in 1914, and a communal shrine to represent all the ones that were taken in a British punitive expedition. So these plaques, and there's some in the DIA and museums all around the world, had covered the walls of the palace to be able to tell the story. Adventures and accomplishments of the Oba, just like the ivory tusks. So in this one, the Oba is held by two noblemen, and the coral beads, which appear in his regalia and are also worn by the nobleman on the side, represent the sea god because they're acquired in the sea. When you get in close, you can see that the Oba's kilt is much more detailed and has a couple of other power objects that the other ones don't have. You can also see the tremendous amount of detail and patterning that's going on in these plaques. So one of the things that bronze does really well is bring out tremendous detail, and they took advantage of this in these bronze plaques. So you see on his kilt a crocodile head, and the crocodile is a creature that lives in the water and then springs out of it and attacks and then brings its prey back into the water. So this represents the power of the Oba to punish. And it would be made out of a very rich cloth, the finest cloth for the Oba specifically. So just to give you an idea, this is Peter Paul Rubens and the disembarkment at Marseille. And it's showing the queen, and she's being held in a particular way, the same way as the Oba, where the arms are being held. It kind of says, I'm too important to be able to hold my own arms. I always have people that represent my power attached to me. So this is one of my favorite pieces, and there's four of these. The one at the Met I've seen in person, and the Met released really great photographs of it, but seeing it in person, there's really no substitute for it. So this pendant mask is carved out of ivory, and carving ivory can be kind of like carving wood, in that there can be grain that goes in certain directions, and the artist can use that grain to emphasize the curves and contours that they want to emphasize. So we see that in this one. In the picture, I think you're getting this kind of like uncanny effect. It almost feels like this figure is going to come alive, extremely naturalistic. But in person, it's even more so. So you can see it from the side. Again, incredible kind of like detail and warmth to this. It really seems like it's going to come alive. Along the top, these figures that look kind of like Space Invaders, the video game, probably represents the Portuguese. So in the 1480s, the Portuguese established a trading relationship with the Edo people. So for things like cowrie, cloth, coral, brass, weapons for ivory, spices, and then later slaves. But remember, like this in most African, West African kingdoms, originally these types of trades did make some of them wealthy, but because of the uneven relationship that you see over time, especially the fact that they're trading slaves, all of the West African powers kind of reduced in wealth from the 15th to the 19th century. So when the Portuguese came, they came from the sea, and remember their kind of relationships with water and with the sea and with power that we've already seen. So the Edo people may have thought they're relatives of Loken, who is a popular deity. Also thought that they were important enough to place on this particular pendant mask. So what you also see is some of these figures are in the form of a mudfish. And the mudfish, kind of like the crocodile, has an interesting relationship where it's in the water, but it's also on dry land. This transformation is important to the Edo people because, again, royalty kind of see their power as coming from the gods and the water and kind of bringing it to the land.